Looking back, I think the hardest part of watch collecting actually turned out to be the easiest for me. For years, I thought the challenge was discovering my taste, finding that one watch that perfectly matched what I loved, that watch that made me think this is exactly what I've been looking for. But now, I think finding my taste almost ruined my collection. Not because I bought bad watches, and also not because I made poor financial decisions. And of course, it wasn't because I didn't do enough research. The biggest mistake I ever made wasn't buying the wrong watch, it was actually buying too many versions of the right one. And the strange part is, I don't think I realized I was doing it until years and years later. Because looking back now, I don't think I was really buying watches anymore. I was trying to repeat successful decisions that I had made over and over again. So today, I want to tell you how I eventually realized that because I have a feeling I'm not the only collector who's done it. I think every collector remembers the moment that they discovered what they liked. Not the first watch they ever owned, but the first watch that made them think, this feels like me. For some people, that's a vintage dress watch. For others, it's a diver or a chronograph or maybe a GMT. But whatever it is, there's usually one watch that quietly becomes the standard that everything else gets compared to. Now, at first, that sounds like a good thing. After all, discovering your taste feels like progress in watch collecting. It feels like you've finally figured yourself out as a collector. And that's exactly what I thought. But what I didn't realize was that discovering your taste is not the finish line. In many ways, it's where the next challenge begins. Because once you've found something that exceeds every expectation you had, it's incredibly easy to spend years trying to recreate that exact same feeling. And that's what I did. Before I ever owned a luxury watch, I spent years learning. Like so many of us, I watched videos, I read forums, I compared specifications and studied brands and imagined what that first purchase might eventually be. And there was one watch that had captured my attention long before I was ever in a position to buy. It was a Rolex Daytona, a rose gold, chocolate dial, Arabic numerals Rolex Daytona. I absolutely loved it. It was the first watch that made me think I could see myself wearing a watch like that, and it's good looking. But I also knew it wasn't realistic, not for where I was in life at that time. And around the same time, I started paying more attention to another, more practical Rolex for me, the Sky-Dweller. The more I had learned about it, the more it made sense. It had 100 meters of water resistance, it was a GMT, it had an annual calendar, and the ring command bezel, which I thought was one of the most clever and intuitive systems that Rolex had ever engineered. It was a watch that I could see myself wearing every single day. Now, again, it wasn't the original watch I had dreamed about, but in many ways, it became an even better answer to what I actually needed at that point in my life. Now, by the time I was approaching my 30th birthday, I'd worked a whole lot of extra hours, saved consistently, and reached some important milestones in my career that I was proud of. And buying that watch became much more than just buying a luxury item for me. It represented years of work, discipline, progress. It was something I genuinely earned. And I still remember one detail that probably sounds ridiculous to anyone outside this hobby. Long before I had even bought the watch, I had already purchased a navy blue rubber B strap for the watch. I had seen a picture of a blue Sky-Dweller on that strap, and in my mind, that was the watch. When I finally bought the Sky-Dweller, I almost never wore it on the oyster bracelet. For the next 2 years, it lived on that rubber bee. Exactly the way I'd imagined it. And something happened that at the time, I didn't think much about. For almost 2 years, I never seriously thought about buying another watch. I was still learning. I was still watching videos and reading articles, and I was still just as fascinated by watches, but I wasn't looking for the next purchase because I genuinely believed I'd found it. I wasn't chasing another watch. I was just enjoying the one I already had. Now, looking back, that's actually pretty unusual. I think a lot of collectors spend those first couple of years thinking about what's next and learning about themselves and their tastes. I didn't, though. The Sky-Dweller had exceeded every expectation that I had. It fit exactly the way I hoped it would. It worked exactly the way I wanted it to, and it represented exactly what I hoped it would represent in my life. Now, without realizing it, it quietly became my benchmark, not just for what great watchmaking looks like, but for what owning a great watch actually feels like. And at the time, I thought that was the end of the journey. I had discovered my taste, I had found my watch, and then just under 2 years later, something changed. I received a major promotion at work. And naturally, I started thinking about celebrating it and what that would look like. And for the first time since buying the Sky-Dweller, I found myself asking a question that I hadn't actually considered in years. What would my second luxury watch be? I assumed that was the beginning of building a collection. But looking back now, I think it was actually the beginning of something else that's really important to my journey as a collector. Now, if you would have asked me back then what I was looking for in a second watch, I probably would have told you I wanted something different. And I genuinely believed that. I had thought about the Daytona again. But just like before, it was still really difficult to justify for me. And around that same time, I found myself becoming fascinated by another Rolex model that doesn't get talked about nearly as much, but I think offers a lot of the same things as a Daytona. And that was the Yacht-Master II. And specifically, this one was the updated stainless steel version released in 2017 with the white dial and Mercedes hands. Now, at first glance, it seemed like a completely different watch than the Sky-Dweller. Instead of a GMT, it had a regatta timer, of all things. It had a much sportier personality. It was louder, it was more playful, more unusual within collecting circles. But the more I researched it, the more familiar it started to feel. I also really loved that it used the ring command bezel as well. And I loved that it felt mechanically unique. And then I did something that, looking back, says more than I realized at the time. I started comparing dimensions. I wanted to make sure I knew how it would fit me. Now, my Sky-Dweller was a 42 millimeter case. It was about 50 millimeters lug to lug and just under 14 millimeters thick. Then we have the Yacht-Master II, 44 millimeters across, but almost identical everywhere else that actually mattered on the wrist. About 50 lug to lug, about 14 millimeters thick. The overall presence was similar, and I remember thinking, perfect. I already know exactly how this is going to fit. It's going to make it exactly what I need. Now, at the time, that felt like smart research. But looking back, I think it was clue number one. Not because there was anything wrong with buying the Yacht-Master II. I still think it was a fantastic decision. But the clue was how I arrived there. Without realizing it, I wasn't evaluating the Yacht-Master II as its own watch. I was measuring how closely it matched an ownership experience that I already knew I loved. And at the time, that distinction never even crossed my mind. At first, everything seemed to confirm that I had made the right decision. The Sky-Dweller remained my everyday watch. The Yacht-Master II became the watch I'd wear on weekends, or when I was out with friends, or whenever I wanted something a little more casual. They complemented each other beautifully. Or at least, that's what I thought. Then, just a couple of weeks later, I had just gotten my Yacht-Master II, and I had another thought that crossed my mind. I realized there was one situation that my collection still didn't really cover: the gym. I wanted something lighter, something I wouldn't mind wearing while exercising, even though I had been wearing one of the Rolex watches to the gym. So I bought my first Omega Aqua Terra. It was a white dial, 38.5 millimeter version on a gray strap. Now, on paper, it was exactly what I was looking for. It was versatile, it was comfortable, it was sporty, and elegant enough to wear pretty much anywhere. And it also filled a role that my two Rolexes didn't. Everything pointed towards it being a perfect addition. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. Not with the watch, but just with my experience of wearing it. Every time I looked down at my wrist, it felt small. Not in an objective sense, but just compared to what I'd been accustomed to wearing. It had way less wrist presence, it felt lighter, it was less substantial, and it didn't give me the same feeling that the Sky-Dweller and the Yacht-Master II gave me every time I put them on. So I returned it. At the time, I thought I'd simply learn something about my preferences. I guess I just don't like smaller watches. And that seemed like a perfectly reasonable conclusion. But looking back, I don't think that's what happened at all. Because the Aqua Terra wasn't failing to be a great Aqua Terra. It was failing to be like my Rolexes on the wrist. And those are two completely different things. So again, the problem wasn't the watch. The problem was the standard that I was unconsciously measuring it against. Of course, it felt different. It was supposed to. But without realizing it, I wasn't judging the Aqua Terra on its own merits. I was judging it by how closely it recreated an experience that I'd already decided was perfect for me. The Aqua Terra never really had a chance. I didn't understand that at the time. So I just moved on, chalked it up to didn't like that watch. Now, eventually, my collection continued to grow. The Grand Seiko Night Birch entered the collection. It was an exciting piece for me. And later, another Aqua Terra, this time a blue day-date version in 41 millimeters. Now, again, if you'd asked me why I bought either one of those, I could have given you completely different reasons. The Grand Seiko represented everything I admired about Japanese watchmaking, the finishing, the incredible dial that was inspired by nature. It was just gorgeous seeing it in person. And then the Aqua Terra. It was one of the most versatile everyday watches on the market with a larger case that felt much more familiar on my wrist, and I didn't have a day-date complication in my collection yet. So every purchase made perfect sense on its own. But there was something I couldn't see just yet. Whenever I went to my watches, whenever I wasn't consciously trying to rotate my collection, the Sky-Dweller kept winning. Not every day, but often enough that I started to notice that it was happening. Now, at first, I interpreted that as just a confirmation for me. See, I bought the right watch in the first place. But looking back, I think it should have raised a different question that I didn't have the insight to be able to see at that time. Why did every road seem to lead back to the same ownership experience? At the time, I didn't know how to answer that question. So I simply assumed that I had learned everything there was to learn from that chapter of my collecting journey, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Now, years had passed. I had become a more experienced collector. I had owned more watches. I had learned more about movements, about finishing, about different independent brands, and high horology. Now, naturally, I assumed I had become a little bit of a more sophisticated buyer. I had always wanted a JLC, and so I ended up buying the Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Ultra Thin Moon in black. I loved it. It was elegant, it was simple, and it had a nice touch of complication. But in the back of my brain, there was another JLC that I actually was more excited about, and I never thought that I would have the opportunity to own it. And that was the Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Ultra Thin Moon in the enamel dial white gold version. Then about a year later, I actually had the chance to buy that watch in a highly upgraded form, which was the perpetual calendar version. I didn't think I'd get the chance to own that, so I jumped at it. And let me tell you, it is one of the most remarkable watches I've ever owned. Not because it's the most practical, not because it's the most versatile, but because every single time I look at it, I found something new to appreciate. The hand guilloche dial, the enamel work, the perpetual calendar, the proportions, the engineering. This was not just another watch. It became the watch that represented everything I loved about traditional watchmaking. And I lived with that piece for about a year until I started to be captivated by another watch. And that was because I loved my Grand Seiko so much and I liked the style of Japanese watchmaking. So this was around the time that the Crador H2 had started to become more prevalent in social media. I'd started to see it a little bit more, and I started to do some research on the brand. Now again, a piece like that was way beyond what I was ready for at that time, but I was ready to look for an interesting alternative, and I found one. The Crador GCAR 971. So this is one of Crador's thermocompensated quartz watches, and if you ever see one in person, you'll understand why I was captivated. Its finishing is extraordinary, its proportions are beautiful, its elegance is unlike almost anything that I've ever owned. So once I had that piece, then I started looking at Omega again. Same thing. Just like Grand Seiko, I loved Omega, and I wanted to have an Omega in the collection. But I knew, having fought the battle between Omega and my Sky-Dweller before, I wasn't going to make that mistake again. So this time, I thought, what if I could get an Omega, but have it have a very different character and personality about the watch? And that was when I discovered the Omega London Boutique Edition that ultimately joined the collection. Now again, a completely different watch, a different story, a different reason for buying it. On paper, none of those watches had anything to do with one another. But eventually, I noticed something that felt strangely familiar to me. Whenever I wanted that elegant experience on the wrist, whenever I wanted to sit at my desk, glance down at my wrist, and admire that beautiful craftsmanship that I had come to appreciate, there was one watch that I wanted to reach for, and it was my Jaeger-LeCoultre. Not because the Crador wasn't exceptional, not because the Omega was not beautiful and super uncharacteristic of a Seamaster model, but because once again, the first watch had quietly become my benchmark. And that is when something finally clicked. Years earlier, I had done the same thing with versatile sports watches. And now I was doing it with elegant dress watches. Different brands, different price points, different complications, and a very different stage of my collecting journey. But it was the exact same decision-making process that I had used before. And that's when I stopped asking myself whether I had simply bought similar watches. Instead, I started asking a much more interesting question. How did I make the same mistake twice in two completely different categories of watches? As someone who prides myself on never needing a lesson twice. Because if the pattern repeated itself years later, it couldn't just be about Rolex. It couldn't just be about the size. And it couldn't just be about sports watches either. There had to be something much deeper going on. And I became fascinated by figuring out what it was. Now, after thinking about all of this for a long time, I eventually realized I had been asking myself the wrong question again. I kept asking, why do I keep buying similar watches? But that actually wasn't what was happening. The similarities weren't the cause, they were the symptom. The real question was much deeper than that. Why did the first watch in each category become the standard that every future watch had to live up to? And once I started looking at it that way, everything made sense. The Sky-Dweller wasn't just my favorite sports watch. It had become my definition of what a great sports watch felt like. The Jaeger-LeCoultre wasn't just my favorite elegant watch. It had become my definition of what an elegant watch should be. And without realizing it, every new purchase was quietly being compared to those two benchmarks before I ever gave it the chance to become something completely different. So I wasn't really asking, is this watch great on its own? I was asking, how closely does this recreate an ownership experience that I've already fallen in love with? And those are two very different questions. And they lead to completely different collections. One allows every watch to stand on its own. The other asks every new watch to prove that your favorite watch was right all along. So I don't think I was trying to buy another watch. I think that I was trying to repeat a successful decision that I had already made. Think again about the Sky-Dweller. It celebrated years of hard work, it marked my 30th birthday, and it became part of my everyday life for almost 2 full years. It exceeded every expectation that I had. Of course, my brain wanted to repeat that success again. And then years later, the Jaeger-LeCoultre did something very similar. Not in the same way exactly, but on an emotional level. It represented everything I admired about traditional watchmaking. So once again, when it came time to add another watch, my instinct wasn't to ask, okay, what experience is missing from my collection here? Instead, it was asking, can I find another watch that gives me this feeling? Now, I don't think that's unique to me. In fact, I think it's incredibly human to have this experience. When something works exceptionally well, our natural instinct is not to start over. It's to trust the proven formula that already proved itself. Now, the problem is, a collection doesn't grow because you keep proving your favorite watch was the right choice. It grows when you're willing to let another watch challenge what you thought the right choice even was. That sentence completely changed the way I think about collecting because suddenly this wasn't about avoiding overlap anymore. It wasn't about divers versus dress watches. It wasn't about having one watch from every category. It was just about remaining curious, about allowing yourself to experience a watch without immediately comparing it to that one that's already sitting on the pedestal in your mind. Because if every purchase simply confirms what you already know, eventually your collection stops teaching you anything new. So looking back, I don't think finding my taste almost ruined my collection because I kept buying similar watches. I think it almost ruined my collection because I stopped letting myself be surprised. Every new watch purchase quietly started with the same question. Not when I was researching, but once I actually got the watch. And the question was, does this feel like the watches that I already know I love? And the problem is, the answer was almost always going to favor what I already owned. For years, I thought that becoming a more experienced collector meant becoming more certain about brands, more certain about case sizes, more certain about complications, and about design. But now, I think experience should do something else. I think experience should give us the confidence to question our assumptions and not just reinforce them. Because if your collection never challenges your preferences, how do you know whether your preferences are actually growing? That's the question I wish I'd been asking years ago. Not, is this another great watch? But is this watch teaching me or allowing me to experience something that I don't already know? And sometimes the answer will honestly be no. Sometimes you'll realize that what you already own is actually the best expression of what you're looking for. And there's nothing wrong with that. But every once in a while, a watch will completely change the way you think. It will make you appreciate a different size, maybe a different philosophy of design, a different kind of movement. Those are the watches that shape us as collectors. Not because they're objectively better, but because they expand our understanding of what we enjoy. And when I look back over my own collecting journey, I don't think the watches I remember most are the ones that confirmed what I already believed. They're the ones that changed my mind. That's why the biggest mistake I ever made wasn't buying the wrong watch. It was buying too many versions of the right one. Because the right watch should become a part of your journey, but not the destination that every future decision gets measured against. Looking back now, I think this realization quietly changed every collecting decision I've made since. And it doesn't mean that I'll never buy watches that overlap. It doesn't mean that every new watch has to be radically different. It simply means that I try to catch myself whenever I start comparing a watch to my favorite one before I've even given it a chance to stand on its own. Because sometimes the best watches we'll ever own are the ones that completely change what we thought we liked. And if we never allow that to happen, we might build a collection that perfectly reflects our past, but never one that grows with us. You know, it's kind of funny. When I bought my first luxury watch, I thought the challenge would be discovering my taste. The real challenge was making sure that that discovery didn't stop me from continuing to grow. Thank you so much for watching. Have you ever looked back and realized that you weren't really buying another watch, but you were trying to recreate the ownership experience of one that you already loved? Or has there been a watch that completely changed the way that you thought about watch collecting? If you enjoyed this one, please do like the video and subscribe to my channel, and I will talk to you all again next time. Bye-bye.